welcome to MINDSHOCK True Crime. You are listening to the Missing 411 series. This is episode 3, 20th Century. Strange Disappearances. Accounts of the most bizarre vanishings of the 1900s. Quite a few cases that cannot be explained by conventional means, or at least there's not enough evidence to support conventional explanations. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Help support MINDSHOCK. Help us get more mind-shocking content out there with logic and reason in typical MINDSHOCK fashion, unlike any other mainstream media source out there, or almost any sources. There's definitely a dearth of logical analysis in some of these areas that sorely needs to be filled, and that's what MINDSHOCK is for. You can also support MINDSHOCK by becoming a YouTube member right here on YouTube for exclusive access to streams and chats. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications, like and share the podcast, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast, or requests. You could also be a guest depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals of any kind, leave them in the comment section. So let's continue on here in the history of these bizarre disappearances on the Mysterious Universe article. Of course, stories of such baffling vanishings have continued into more modern times as well. In April of 1959, a man named Bruce Campbell... And you know what's curious? Bruce Campbell himself was born in 1958, but so this is obviously, or I assume is not obviously, unless we're talking parallel dimensions. Yeah, Bruce Campbell, this is not Bruce Campbell of Evil Dead fame, but Bruce Campbell was traveling by car with his wife from Massachusetts to go visit their son who lived far away. At one point on their long cross-country journey, they allegedly stopped for the night at a motel in Jacksonville, Illinois. The couple, exhausted from driving all day, promptly retired for the night when Mrs. Campbell... I don't know why I find Bruce Campbell so funny, but when Mrs. Campbell woke up in the morning, she found that her husband was no longer in the bed with her. At first, she was not so concerned, thinking he'd just gotten up early, but it soon became clear that he was nowhere in the room. Even more strangely, Bruce's clothes were still right where he had left them the previous evening, and his suitcase had not been touched, meaning that he had gone outside in his pajamas. Additionally, all of his personal belongings and even his wallet with all of his money were also still precisely where he'd left them. Even after an investigation by authorities, Bruce Campbell was never found. So let's dive a little deeper here. I don't know. So this is from Haunted Jacksonville by Troy Taylor and Lisa Taylor Horton. I don't know where they got most of this info, but I'll go through a more in-depth account here. The man in the green pajamas, last seen at the Sandman Hotel. It's interesting. Might be ominous as well. Weird things can happen anywhere, including Jacksonville, Illinois, the home of American Hauntings, Inc. In April 1959, one of the most mysterious disappearances of the American 20th century took place when a man named Bruce Nelson Campbell stumbled out of his Jacksonville motel room one night dressed only in a pair of green pajamas and was never seen again. What happened? Well, he stumbled out. Do we have evidence of that? That he stumbled out? Because his wife woke up and he was gone. Does that mean he stumbled out? Could have been an alien abduction. Could have been an interdimensional rift that opened up on just one side of the bed. How do they know he stumbled out? But continuing on here, what happened to the New England stockbroker has never been determined. He simply vanished without a trace. That April, Bruce Campbell, age 57, and his wife, Mabelita, drove to Illinois from Northampton, Massachusetts. The reason for their visit was meant to be a happy one. They had traveled to see their newly born first grandson, son of Bruce Jr., who was an assistant professor of chemistry at McMurray College in Jacksonville. For some reason, the long drive to Illinois was especially hard on Campbell, and he began feeling sick while he was in the car. The stock investment counselor became confused and disoriented, and when they arrived in Jacksonville, Mrs. Campbell checked them into the Sandman Motel, a small family-owned establishment that was typical of motor lodges of the day. It was located on the northwest side of town on Walnut Street, where a Casey's store now stands. Each room had a door that opened to the outside, and parking was located right outside the guest's room. Campbell was put immediately into bed after they checked into the motel. Bruce Jr. arranged for Dr. E.C. Bone, a local physician, to visit his father. Dr. Bone gave him some medication to help him sleep, but it didn't seem to work. 2 days passed before Campbell seemed to show some signs of improvement. On the evening of April 14th, Campbell visited with his family. Bruce Jr. later recalled that his father was rational but still disoriented during his last visit with him. Twice later on that night, Mrs. Campbell said her husband asked her if their station wagon, which was parked outside of their room in the motel's parking lot, was locked up. She told him that it was, shortly before going to sleep. She later woke at 2:15 a.m. and, the only other thing that make the story even creepier is if it was 3 or 3:30 a.m., but apparently it was 2:15 a.m. and saw that the other double bed in the room was empty. Her husband was gone. She immediately got out of bed to look for him, and when she realized that he was not in the bathroom, hurried to the door of the room, which was unlatched. There was no sign of him in the parking lot, and the desk clerk on duty said that he had not seen anyone walking past the office. The Campbell's car was still sitting in the lot, the doors were locked, and it was undisturbed. Because of her husband's weakness and disorientation, Mrs. Campbell quickly called the police. When officers arrived at the motel, she offered a description of the tall, balding man with a slight limp and explained when he had left the motel room, he was wearing only a pair of bright green pajamas, a wristwatch, and a ring with the Delta Upsilon fraternity crest on it. His wallet containing all his money, his shoes, his eyeglasses, and his car keys were still in the motel room. Police officers searched the surrounding area, the darkened streets, and the Jacksonville downtown area, but there was no sign of Campbell. The next morning, a request was put out for more information. Theories of murder, suicide, and amnesia led searchers to local creeks, farm buildings, and wells. Jacksonville Police Chief Ike Flynn and Captain Charles Runkle surveyed the entire area, both in a fixed-wing aircraft and later by helicopter. They found nothing. The next day, local firefighters joined the search using a boat to dredge Mouvaster Creek. This looks like quite a thorough search here. About 150 students from McMurray College joined the search too. On the third day, the entire 235-member male population of McMurray students and staff joined with 50 students from Jacksonville High School to help comb the area. So we have hundreds of people combing the area, the creek dredged, helicopter searches. This is quite substantial. The Jacksonville Courier reported that the massive volunteer search team, broken into smaller groups, covered a 6-mile radius around Jacksonville, including creeks and ponds. It was assumed that since there were no reports of a barefoot man in green pajamas walking around the city, and since the Sandman was on the north side, that Campbell must have traveled north into recently planted farm fields. Unfortunately, this assumption turned out to be overly optimistic. Despite the search, no trace of Campbell was found. Dozens of reports of tall hitchhikers from the surrounding area, including Whitehall, Murrayville, Woodson, New Berlin, and Alexander, kept the police busy for days, but the leads went nowhere. Police Chief Flynn told the newspaper, "We have looked every place that has been suggested and have run out of ideas on what to do next." A fortune teller told us that Campbell was 7 miles from Jacksonville, either northeast or northwest of the city. We have even looked there. 7's an interesting number, but it's also curious that the fortune teller did not specify whether it was northeast or northwest, so hedging their bets there. Whoever this psychic was, they might have been onto something, however. The newspaper reported that the last solid lead, pretty much the only solid lead, came in when police were about a week into the search. A farmer who lived several miles northwest of the city told investigators that he had been awakened by shouting on or near his property on the night that Campbell went missing. The police checked the area, but nothing was found. Chief Flynn told the Courier that the case was one of the most baffling mysteries that had occurred here. So obviously the shouting, that could have been anybody for any reason, right? So, that's kind of weird. The search for Bruce Nelson Campbell, the man in the green pajamas, unless this is the most peaceful town ever, and there's never shouting, and the only night there was ever any shouting was the night this guy goes missing, then maybe. I don't know. The search for Bruce Nelson Campbell, the man in the green pajamas, continued for days and weeks, and then it stretched into years. Mabelita Campbell had reluctantly gone home after 2 weeks of fruitless searching, but the family refused to give up hope that he would be found alive until 1967, when he was finally declared legally dead. Mrs. Campbell passed away in 2004, never learning what had become of her husband. After several months of extensive searching by the Jacksonville police, the FBI launched its own investigation into the case. That's kind of weird, though. The FBI is getting involved here for a missing adult with no signs of a crime. On the first anniversary of Campbell's disappearance, it was revealed that the distraught Campbell family had spent almost all of their savings on private investigators who distributed Mr. Campbell's photo and description to police departments around the country, that also offered a $5,000 reward for information, which no one ever collected. Unfortunately, this was the only thing that the FBI learned about the disappearance. Like the private investigators who worked the case, the federal agents found no trace of Campbell. The case of the man in the green pajamas turned out to be the last significant case of Police Chief Ike Flynn's career. Just weeks after the vanishing, Flynn retired and Charles Runkle was promoted to succeed him. Runkle later recalled, even though he was off duty, Flynn never let the case go. He died of cancer several months after he retired, haunted to his grave by the missing man. Until the very end of his life, he never stopped checking in at the department to see if any new clues had surfaced. They had not, and even today, the case remains unsolved. What became of Campbell? No one knows. He simply walked away on the dark nighttime streets of Jacksonville and was never heard from again, unless, of course, he didn't walk away. Now, cynicism and too much true crime TV show watching and FBI statistics would suggest it was the significant other. But here's the thing. If this is just some mild-mannered housewife, I mean, obviously, when the guy's not feeling well, that would be prime time to bump him off if you wanted to bump him off. But what would she have done with the body? Because, again, if we trust the clerk at the motel, he said nobody walked by, which means everything would have had to have been confined to the room. I mean, I don't have the layout of the motel here, but supposedly, I mean, if it was a motor lodge and you could just pull up to the room and maybe circle around the opposite side of the office, perhaps you could not be, maybe it is possible to not be seen. In which case, if he did get a ride with somebody, I'm assuming they checked out all the other guests. And wouldn't that be kind of random for a non-guest to pull up without the clerk seeing? Unless, of course, the clerk was on some kind of break, but, I mean, that would have to be, I mean, quite a coincidence. I wonder also if there was maybe some kind of cover-up with the doctor, because the guy's not feeling good. This doctor's named E.C. Bone. That's kind of ominous. At the Sandman Motel. I mean, this is just a lot of ominous names here. So an article here from the IllinoisTimes.com by Scott Maruna, August 12, 2004, states here Campbell was restless and paranoid that night, his wife told police, according to a later account by Charles Runkle, a Jacksonville police captain at the time. Twice before 1 a.m., Campbell uncharacteristically awakened her to ask whether their car was locked, she said. Twice she reassured him and told him to go back to sleep. When she woke again on her own at 2:15 a.m., she was alone. So this guy's really paranoid about the vehicle being locked. So did he go out to check that it was locked? But if there was no sign of any struggle, any fight, nothing, why would somebody kill him randomly, and how could they have perfectly gotten rid of the body at just some random motor lodge? I mean, that is very, very strange. The article mentions here there were local firefighters in boats who dredged the local branch of the Mavis Stair Creek. And, of course, hundreds and hundreds of people searched for him. It's also curious. It says the search crew covered a 6-mile radius, and then the fortune teller said he was 7 miles out. I mean, that's kind of weird. Especially if the fortune teller knew about the 6-mile radius search. So, also, Campbell was 6'4", and he walked with a slight limp. So, theoretically, this would be easy to spot. I mean, quite a tall guy with a limp in bright green pajamas. Now, apparently there were dozens of reports of tall hitchhikers. And some of them were actually given rides by police, but they were not him. This article stated it was a $500 reward, not $5,000. So this was back in the 50s, so that would have been a lot of money. All right, so here's some rumors. 3 locals, so this article was written in 2004, so I'm not sure if they're referring to the period the article was written or several months. But it says, today, 3 locals who wish to remain anonymous recalled whispered stories describing how a girlfriend had picked Campbell up at the hotel and whisked him off to a new life, but there's no proof. Another longtime resident is convinced that foul play was involved. Dr. Edwin Ecker, retired math professor at McMurray College, said his colleague Campbell Jr. was certain there was no fight, no history of depression, or anything of the sort between his parents. And of course, if there was, I mean, a lot of times the kids don't know, so. Freiberg recalls that the younger Campbell later spoke of his father in terms of being deceased, though Freiberg never pried into the son's reasoning for this belief. Runkle, the police captain, even remembers a report of a disturbance at Jacksonville's First Presbyterian Church, Bruce Campbell Jr.'s church. Not long after the disappearance, it seemed one woman began accusing another of being responsible for the disappearance. Runkle notes, though, that this woman was also known for mental instability. As far as mysteries go, Jacksonville had never seen anything like that doggone thing, Runkle says. As far as a case where absolutely nothing, no clues, nothing was ever found. It probably never will see anything like that again either. 8 years after Campbell's disappearance, the Courier ran a brief article reporting that Mabaletta Campbell had finally received benefits from her husband's life insurance policy. Campbell Sr. was, as far as the insurance company was concerned, finally dead, but was he? Today, for residents of Jacksonville, Bruce Campbell's disappearance ranks right up there with Amelia Earhart's and Jimmy Hoffa's. In that we never found anything one way or another, I suppose you might say the case is still open, but I don't think we're going to learn anything now, Runkle says. It was just the darndest thing. And regarding the wife, so if she killed him for money, it does seem strange that she would wait 8 years just to avoid more suspicion. But on the other hand, if the motive wasn't money, then maybe not. And then, of course, she might not be involved at all. But what are the chances I would assume, were there any other guests at the motel? Because if there were 0 other guests at the motel, that would be strange. You would think the clerk would recall a vehicle pulling up at 2 o'clock in the morning, but who knows? The thing that is weird is supposedly he was feeling sick and he was disoriented and possibly paranoid, in which case stumbling off in the middle of the night might be an option, but how far could he have gotten without his body being discovered? Or any traces at all, unless someone did give him a ride out of the area and was not aware. This is the 50s, so there was no internet bulletin or anything. So they gave him a ride somewhere really far, and then he just, I don't know, maybe his mental state deteriorated further. Who knows? Here's an interesting post by a Redditor on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. User since deleted. His odd behavior during the long journey was likely to be the result of a transient ischemic attack or similar. He was just about the right age for one. People over 60 are more susceptible. I should know. As a sufferer, long journeys are out. I will never visit the USA, for example. I think the inability to move around much is problematic. I almost died once on an inner-city train journey. Fortunately, the staff were brilliant, as they made an unscheduled stop at a rural station and an ambulance was waiting. During the attack, one can be in all manner of abnormal mental states which defy description. Fortunately, they go away after a few hours, but in the interim, he could well have wandered off, hitched a lift, picked a fight, or done something else completely out of character. I consider it very likely that he had 2 or more attacks, those after the first being influenced in a bad way by his medical treatment. Unfortunately, the barbiturates the doctor prescribed would have made matters worse rather than better. A central nervous system depressant is the last thing needed in such a situation. Another theory posed by someone else is, my guess is that he died in an accident at the Sandman on its property after leaving his room, and his body never, under its own power, left the premises. His death was hidden and will remain so. Other responses here. I'd guess he stepped out his room to check that car one last time. Perhaps his wife had seemed perplexed the second time he woke her to ask, so he didn't want to be a bother, and he was struck by a vehicle and then loaded inside. Perhaps the driver was drunk and panicked. Counterpoints there, there'd probably be some kind of evidence. Some other interesting findings here. The low temperature that night in Jacksonville, Illinois was 34 degrees. So supposedly he would have died of exposure after just being in pajamas. I mean, how far could he have really gotten? 34 degrees? That's quite cool. That is quite cool. Another post here, quite astute reasoning. What if he'd thought he'd seen someone doing something that made him suspect they were trying to break into his car? That could explain him asking his wife about the car being locked. And, you know, another good point here, just because someone's being paranoid, there's not a magical break in the universe from criminals trying to break into cars. Now, I'm not saying that happened here, but there's no magical force field where people who are going through some kind of mental episodes of some kind, maybe even hallucinating, there's no magical pause button on criminals. So it's weird how a lot of so-called true crime aficionados, they kind of pretend nothing bad could have happened to someone who was a drug user, as if a serial killer or a potential violent criminal offender would just magically not attack somebody who's having some kind of episode or even drug issues. I mean, it's so weird. I never understood that line of so-called reasoning from the true crime community in all of these cases. You see this in the Lisa Lam case. I mean, some of these cases, it's weird. It's like people think there's just some kind of magical force field from criminals to anyone who's experiencing any kind of mental episode or drug scenario. Really weird. Now, of course, if that is not a high crime area, and I mean, again, you'd have to go through all those statistics to weigh these options, but continuing on here, that could explain him asking his wife about the car being locked. If the wife was asleep the second time he woke her, she may not have been fully awake. She may have heard him say the word car and assumed it was more, is the car locked? Annoying chatter from him again. That's a good point. It sounds as if she was tired, annoyed about having her sleep disturbed, and gone back to sleep quickly. If she was truly awake, wouldn't she have found out why her husband had awakened her twice to ask if the car was locked? I know I would. I think most people would want to know why it was an issue important to be woken up twice about. Maybe after she was asleep, he stepped outside to confront someone who was messing with or close to his car. Perhaps it was a person already in trouble that did not want the police called, so they took him with them, killed him, and disposed of him elsewhere. The account of the wife's behavior seems odd to me. Something seems off. Did the husband have a large life insurance policy? Edit. Read the article about all the money the family spent searching for Mr. Campbell and the $5,000 reward. One article said $500 they offered. Also, it was 8 long years before he was declared dead and insurance paid. I wonder how long it would have taken him to walk to the farm where yelling was heard during the night. And that's another good point, too, because if he's going missing at around 2 a.m. and the yelling is, let's say, 2:30 a.m., he didn't walk 7 miles in 20 minutes. So, in 34 degrees. So, that's curious. I mean, he could have obviously gotten a ride, but yeah, there's a lot of curiosities in this case. Some people are speculating there was one lake nearby which was not drained. I would think in eventual years they would have done some kind of searching there, though. Also, it's curious when the last search was with what level of technology. I mean, I examined they're not doing constant searches for something that happened in 1958, or 1959. So, let's continue on here. Back to the Mysterious Universe article. We're still talking Missing 411 and just bizarre disappearances. A similar well-known case involving a couple allegedly occurred in 1975 when a Jackson and Martha Wright were driving from New Jersey to New York City. According to Jackson's version of events, the two were driving through the Lincoln Tunnel in New York City when they noticed that there was a large amount of condensation on their windows. The couple then pulled over, and Jackson went about wiping the fog off the front windshield while Martha took care of the back. It was at this point that Jackson says he turned to see how his wife was doing and found that she was gone. In fact, the woman was nowhere to be seen, even though she had just been there moments before. Jackson would claim that he had not seen or heard anything unusual, and it would have been impossible for her to get very far in such a brief amount of time. Although this all sounds highly suspicious, police were never able to find any evidence of foul play, and Jackson was never considered a suspect in the disappearance. Martha Wright's sudden disappearance remains a baffling mystery. You know, another curiosity, though, is if you really were to harm your significant other, wouldn't someone make up a story of, yeah, there was a fight, she wandered off, or something, I don't know, she wasn't seeming herself, she refused help. I mean, would you just say, oh, yeah, she just vanished into thin air? 1 second she was wiping the window, the next second she's just vanished into thin air. I mean, that seems kind of weird if you're making up if you are the perpetrator and you're making up a weird story, would you go for the supernatural angle? I mean, wouldn't it be even more plausible to say, well, there were lights in the sky and we lost time, not that, oh yeah, right in the middle of wiping the window, she just vanished into thin air. It just seems kind of weird. All right, so yeah, I mean, this is a really weird one because supposedly the disappearance was directly in the Lincoln Tunnel. And this was back in the 70s, so this would be very unlikely now because, not just because of cameras and all that, but just because Jackson reported that there were no other cars in the Lincoln Tunnel. When was the last time there wasn't a single other car in the Lincoln Tunnel? But apparently they had to pull over inside the Lincoln Tunnel because the condensation got so bad. And so she vanished in the tunnel. Then, unless it was right next to one of those service or emergency doors in the tunnel, it doesn't specify that here because I don't know what their spacing is, but they're not that close together. So you'd have to cover a good distance to get to one or the other. So unless they were pulled over right next to one and there were like mole people or some serial killer just popped out and grabbed her, I mean, Jackson would have heard that, right? I mean, you can't do that silently. So yeah, it's not to mention sometimes I don't remember. I'd have to look up exactly what they look like, but I'm assuming that there's some kind of railing or something. I mean, I don't know. I guess some of them may or may not have. I might also be getting my tunnels mixed up. There's more than one tunnel there. So yeah, just a really baffling case. And again, most people are also saying, yeah, that if he really did kill her, shouldn't he have been able to come up with something, I mean, better than that story? Better than something supernatural of that nature in the Lincoln Tunnel. And supposedly he was thoroughly investigated by the police. So, again, doesn't really mean anything specific, but back to unresolved mysteries for people's thoughts on this from a number of years ago. But people are saying there are no continuous walkways in the tunnel. And supposedly it was also snowing heavily. Perhaps that's why there weren't a lot of other cars on the road. Other people are saying that this is not a real case. But, if there's any official missing persons report. Yeah, they were actually asking if the whole story is a hoax. Because there's not a lot to corroborate the existence of this story. And since it was the 70s, like, for example, in the Bruce Campbell, that's from the 50s, and there's all this corroborating evidence. This is a story from the 70s. There does not seem to be corroborating evidence here. So this might even be a complete hoax story. Okay, let's move on then. Even more recent is the strange disappearance of Brian Shaffer, and we actually did an episode on this on MINDSHOCK. You can check that out. Who is a medical student at Ohio State University. April 1st, 2006, Brian went out to have some drinks at a local bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. Some drinks turned into a lot of drinks, and Brian was reported to be heavily intoxicated as the night wore on. At some point between 1:30 and 2 a.m. in the morning, Brian made a drunken call to his girlfriend and then was seen talking to two women at the bar. This would be the last time anyone would ever see him. A subsequent investigation found that no one remembered seeing him after he was witnessed talking to the two women, and this is also on CCTV security footage. And even more bizarrely, security camera footage showed Brian entering the bar, but at no point does it ever actually show him leaving. With no evidence of foul play or any reason for why he would have suddenly disappeared, it remains yet another eerie, unsolved vanishing. On July 18, 2007, there was another case of someone who seems to have just stepped off the face of the earth. 55-year-old Barbara Bolick was out on a hiking trip with her friend Jim Ramaker in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, with Barbara walking about 6 to 9 meters or 20 to 30 feet behind him. At one point along their scenic hike, Jim claimed that he stopped to admire the scenery, and when he turned to look behind him, after a mere minute, Barbara was nowhere to be seen. Now we're really getting to missing 411 territory, because most of these cases are in the wilderness, and seemingly some of them happen when they're right next to other people, and then it's just blink of an eye disappearance like this. A complete search of the surrounding area would turn up no trace of what happened to the woman, and although Jim Ramaker had been the last person to see her, police never found any reason to suspect he had done anything to her. No new leads in the case have ever been found. This is 2007, so we're getting pretty recent now. So here's a write-up from StrangeOutdoors.com, July 28th, 2021. The puzzling disappearance of Barbara Bolick from the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana. Barbara Assunta Bolick disappeared July 18, 2007, Bear Creek Overlook, Bitterroot Mountains, Montana. Barbara Bolick, 55, was last seen near the Bear Creek Overlook in the Bitterroot Mountains west of Victor in Montana on Wednesday, July 18, 2007. Her husband's cousin and the cousin's friend, Jim Ramaker, 58, were visiting from California. Barbara was supposed to take them both out for a hike, but the husband's cousin was hungover, so only Jim and Barbara headed out to the Bitterroot Mountains for a few hours at around 9 a.m. Around noon, Jim stopped to look at the scenic view while Barbara was 20 or 30 feet away. But when he turned around about a minute or two later, she was gone, never to be seen again. Barbara was an experienced hiker and was very familiar with the area. And that's another thing. A lot of these missing 411 cases, these are hunters or people that are specifically familiar with the area they went missing in. So sliding down some kind of unseen ravine, I mean, that's definitely a possibility for someone who's new to the area and not experienced. Obviously, it's less likely for someone who is. Still possible, of course, but just another curiosity here. She was carrying a black daypack at the time of her disappearance, and it contained a .357 Magnum pistol. So she's well armed for either random criminals or animals or whatever. She is armed. Neither Barbara nor her belongings were ever found. That's another curiosity. So her day pack not found, which include the Magnum pistol. So is this really an interdimensional rift that just swallows people and their belongings up whole with leaving no trace? Or somehow have their remains simply not been discovered, even if they've been, their body would be there from some kind of an accident? What is and where is the Bear Creek Overlook Trail? Bear Creek Overlook Trail is a 4.5 mile, 7.2 kilometer, moderately rated and trafficked out and back trail located near Victor, Montana. It features a stunning view of Bear Creek and the surrounding mountains and passes beautiful wildflowers. The trail is best used from March until October and goes through an open forest with low bushes. The disappearance. Barbara lived with her husband, who had previously had a heart attack and didn't hike, so he didn't accompany her. There was no independent corroboration that Barbara was ever on the trail that day. Interesting point there. We have to keep that in mind. Barbara was wearing a pastel-colored shirt and tan shorts, and she had red hair, brown eyes. She wore eyeglasses. An extensive search of the area turned up no sign of Barbara. Jim fully cooperated with investigators and was not named a suspect. Her husband said Barbara was afraid of heights and would not have gone near the edge of a precipice or left the trail. Another good point there. Investigations. Jim Ramaker said Barbara spoke to 2 young men who were also on the trail. Other witnesses confirmed the men were on the trail, but despite the police offering a $10,000 reward to identify them, the 2 potential witnesses were never located. All right, hold on a second. So other witnesses on the trail did see 2 young men, but did not see Barbara. Is that what that means? There's no independent verification of Barbara. So if Jim did harm her, and possibly before they ever got on the trail, and he just made up the story that she talked to 2 young men, would that be a good cover? So this case kind of comes down to how well Jim Ramaker was investigated. Because if he truly could be ruled out, then this is a bizarre case. The 2 men were in their early 20s, accompanied by a black mixed breed dog with floppy ears and white markings. One of them was described as dark-skinned with black hair. The other had a medium complexion and reddish hair. Both men were clean-cut, and they each had an athletic build. They may have been driving a light-colored older model Chevrolet S10 SUV with Missoula County, Montana license plates. What happened to Barbara Bolick? Foul play theory. Jim was a trusted family acquaintance, was possibly dating Barbara's husband's cousin. Perhaps he made sexual advances on Barbara on the hike, there was a struggle, and he killed her, but the alibi for such an attack seemed weak. Also, what did he do with the body? Because there's these 2 young men walking the trails, there's other people walking the trails. I mean, that would be tough. Perhaps the hiking disappearance was a cover-up for Barbara's previous death, and the husband's cousin, and Jim know what happened to her. Now, that seems slightly more likely that it didn't happen on the trail, because if she was never there, of course, they would never find anything. Now, exactly who knew what, how, and how the death occurred, that's, of course, up in the air. Was Barbara abducted and murdered in a random attack? Okay, intentional disappearance theory. Barbara's bank accounts and possessions were untouched. And there's no mention here of what size the bank accounts were. Animal attack, there was no evidence of a bear or mountain lion attack. Misadventure, did Barbara stumble off the path and fall off a cliff? Neither her remains or pack have ever been found. Now again, that doesn't mean they're not there, because many cases searchers did miss. Now, it would be curious if they did flyovers and there is video available of the flyovers, because like the other cases we went over, if someone was found in an area that was previously searched and there is video footage from plane that the body is not there, what does that mean? So here's another article with a bit more information by Jen Baxter, July 24th, 2021 on Medium.com, The Baffling Disappearance of Barbara Bolick. She was less than 30 feet from her hiking partner when she vanished without a trace. Allegedly, of course. Yeah, and he needs to be brain fingerprint scanned, because if you haven't, I talk about that all the time. Brain fingerprint scan is basically a scientific version, a much more scientific version of the polygraph, because it simply measures the brainwave responses to familiar information, so it doesn't matter whether someone's trying to lie or not. Barbara Bolick fell in love with Montana's Bitterroot Mountains the first time she saw them. The 55-year-old was particularly fond of the hiking trail that led to the Bear Creek Overlook near Victor, Montana. She spent many hours on the trail, both alone and with friends. On the morning of Wednesday, July 18, 2007, Barbara volunteered to take a family friend, Jim Ramaker, on a hike to the Bear Creek Overlook. It would be Barbara's last hike. Shortly after she and Jim reached the scenic overlook, Barbara vanished without a trace. Barbara had originally planned to take both Jim and his girlfriend, Donna Biles, on the Wednesday morning hike. Donna was the cousin of Barbara's husband, Carl. She and Jim lived in California but had come to Montana to spend some time with Carl and Barbara. They had both been looking forward to hiking to the Bear Creek Overlook while on their trip, and Barbara had been more than happy to accompany them. Carl, who had been forced to stop hiking after he suffered from a heart attack, told his wife that he would take care of making dinner while the trio went on their hike. The group planned to leave early Wednesday morning, but when Donna woke up, she wasn't feeling well. She decided to skip the hiking trip, so Barbara and Jim made the trip alone. The road leading to the Bear Creek trailhead was closed for repairs when they arrived, forcing them to park a short distance away and walk through a construction zone to get to the trail. Once they reached the trail, they completed the 2.7-mile hike to the scenic overlook located at the top of the trail. Jim and Barbara sat down and had a snack once they reached the top of the trail. They exchanged pleasantries with two other hikers who were already at the overlook with their dog. See, that's curious, though. So the other hikers did not corroborate Barbara's presence? Then spent about 30 minutes enjoying the view. Around 11:30 a.m., they decided to start heading back down the trail. Jim stopped briefly to get one final look at the view. He estimated that Barbara was about 20 to 30 feet in front of him at the time. When Jim turned back around to continue down the trail 45 seconds later, Barbara was gone. Jim walked further down the trail, assuming that he would soon run into Barbara, but he was unable to locate her. She was an extremely experienced hiker who never strayed off the trail, so he was confused by her sudden disappearance. He repeatedly called out for her, but got no response. And it would also be curious if other hikers at least reported him yelling, because if this is all a ruse, how far did he go with it? Jim and Barbara had been on part of the trail that was covered in loose shale rock that crunched loudly underfoot. But Jim didn't hear any noise at all. He took out a whistle and tried using it to attract Barbara's attention, but he got no response. Confused, he continued that downward trek, hoping that he would find Barbara somewhere along the trail. Jim reached the trailhead without finding any sign of Barbara. Not sure what to do, he approached the construction site and asked the workers if they had seen Barbara exit the trail. The workers recalled seeing two young men accompanied by a black and white dog, but not Barbara. One of the construction workers escorted Jim through the construction zone to his car so he could check and see if Barbara had somehow made it to the car without being noticed, but she wasn't there. It was hard for Jim to believe that Barbara had gotten lost on a trail that she knew so well. Convinced he must have just missed her, he hiked back to the trailhead, retraced the path they had taken to the scenic overlook. There was no sign of Barbara anywhere on the trail. Jim made his way back to the construction zone and told the construction workers that he needed help as he couldn't locate his hiking companion. One of the construction workers let him use a phone so he could call and report Barbara missing. Since the Bear Creek Overlook Trail is located within the Bitterroot National Forest, the case was initially handled by U.S. Forest Service Rangers. They launched an immediate search for Barbara, scouring the rugged terrain surrounding the trail for any sign of the missing woman. One of the rangers called Carl at home to let him know that his wife had been reported missing, but seemed confident that they would be able to find her quickly. Carl couldn't believe that Barbara was truly lost. She had hiked that same trail dozens of times and was extremely familiar with the area. He immediately made the 20-mile drive back to the trailhead, hoping that Barbara would be there waiting for him and they would be able to share a laugh about all the commotion. His heart dropped when he arrived and learned that the searchers hadn't found any sign of his wife. The search for Barbara continued throughout the night. Several different search and rescue groups, along with search dogs, were brought in to help with the ground search. Helicopters equipped with infrared and thermal devices scanned the area from above. They found nothing to indicate that Barbara was still in the area. And then, of course, if you haven't checked out the Delphi coverage of the Delphi murders, the MINDSHOCK coverage of the Delphi murders, I go over thermal imaging in one episode pretty extensively. The human body loses heat quite slowly between 1 and 1.5 Celsius degrees per hour, and there is anywhere between a half-hour and 3-hour delay for the cooling process to even begin, and this is in the summer here. So even if this was many hours later, if she had become deceased even very quickly from the last time Ramaker here claims to have seen her, she would have been picked up by the thermal imaging scan, unless she was somehow buried under a rock or something of that nature where it would block her heat signature. Carl waited at the trailhead entrance until midnight when police finally convinced him to go home and get some rest. He was devastated at the thought of leaving while Barbara was still out there somewhere, but reluctantly decided to go home for a few hours. He returned in the morning accompanied by friends and neighbors who were eager to help in the search effort. Authorities admitted that they were baffled by the disappearance. Officials with the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office noted that they had no reason to believe that foul play was involved. Nothing had been found to indicate that Barbara had been involved in any kind of struggle on the trail. There were no drag marks, bloodstains, or shreds of clothing. I wonder if they did check all of their house or hotel rooms of their guests if they were staying in a hotel just to see. But some people theorized that Barbara might have been attacked by a bear or a mountain lion, but officials didn't believe this was the case. Jim hadn't heard Barbara cry out, nor was there any evidence of animal activity along the trail. As an experienced hiker, Barbara knew to keep an eye out for aggressive animals. She carried a .357 Magnum in her day pack in the event that she ran into one. The last person to see Barbara, Jim, fell under immediate suspicion and was interrogated intensely. He fully cooperated with the investigation and even volunteered to take a polygraph examination to confirm his account of what happened. Officials were confident that he had nothing to do with Barbara's disappearance, although it doesn't say whether he actually did do the polygraph and what the results were. The physical search for Barbara continued for the next 2 weeks. Volunteers and professional search and rescue groups had complete grid searches of the entire area, but despite using every resource available, they found no trace of the missing woman. Officials announced that they were stopping the physical search, but the investigation into Barbara's disappearance would continue. 3 weeks after Barbara went missing, the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office announced it was offering a $5,000 reward for any information leading to Barbara's whereabouts. Although a number of tips were called in, including several people who believed Barbara had been abducted by a phantom mountain man, none of them brought investigators any closer to finding Barbara. But if she didn't veer off the trail, I guess it's possible to be abducted without leaving signs of a struggle, but investigators were particularly interested in speaking with the 2 young men who had been seen on the trail the day Barbara vanished. They stressed that the men were not considered suspects in her disappearance, they were considered potential witnesses. And detectives wanted to talk to them about what they might have seen that day. They were the only persons beside Jim who could verify that Barbara had been on the trail when she went missing. So this article is saying, oh, okay, so these men that they couldn't find would have been able to verify if they could be found, if she was really there. But the construction workers said that they left without Barbara, so whatever that means. Both Jim and several of the construction workers have been able to provide police with descriptions of the 2 men, and the descriptions were released to the public. Both of the men had been in their early 20s. One had dark hair and dark skin, while the other had light skin and reddish hair. Both of the men had athletic builds, and they had been hiking with a mixed breed dog that was black with white markings. They had departed the area in a light-colored SUV, possibly a Chevrolet Blazer, that had a Montana license plate with the Missoula County sticker, so police believed they were likely local to the area. And that is kind of shocking that they weren't able to be identified. I mean, it's not like that's like a huge metropolitan area where it would be hard to find somebody. Despite the fact that detailed descriptions of the 2 men were published in local newspapers, no one came forward to identify the men. In September, Barbara's family announced they were offering a $10,000 reward for info leading to the identification of these 2 potential witnesses, but their names remained elusive. As months went by without any progress on the case, some people began to wonder if Barbara had staged her disappearance so she could start a new life somewhere else. Her family and friends were adamant that Barbara would never have done anything like that. Although in many cases where that did happen, of course, family and friends did say the same thing, so. She left the house that day without any of her belongings. Her money, identification, passport, clothing, and all other personal items remained at home. Barbara had been very happy with her life. She had started taking flying lessons shortly before she disappeared and had been looking forward to becoming a private pilot. Well, that's actually a pretty good piece of evidence against that theory, yes. She and Carl were scheduled to take a cruise at the Mexican Riviera that fall. She had so much to look forward to. Her friends also pointed out that Barbara never would have gone anywhere without taking her beloved dog with her. Oh, yeah, that's major. You don't leave your dog behind. Yeah, that's a big piece there, too. Barbara isn't the only person who seemingly vanished without a trace from a national park. There are many other cases where people have suddenly disappeared while just a few feet away from other people. Most of them have never been found. Jim and Donna eventually returned to California, leaving Carl alone to deal with his grief. Jim has continued to stay in contact with authorities, and they maintain that he has always cooperated with the investigation and has never been considered a suspect in Barbara's disappearance. Detectives are still trying to locate the 2 men who were seen hiking with their dog. To date, no one has been able to provide any information leading to their identities. So, yeah, it's just very curious how no one can corroborate that she was on the trail that day. And the 2 potentially people that could have not been found, which is also strange. Because if they're local, if they weren't local, obviously that's different. They're just passing through, boom, gone. But even then, you could still check local hotels, whatever. How many light-colored SUVs are there in that county? Probably a lot, but I bet if they actually did a thorough investigation, maybe a couple thousand? But in all these years, they can go through and see if anybody matches those descriptions. The Charlie Project has her listed 55 years old, 5 foot nothing, 115 pounds. And other points on unresolved mysteries as well, which is what I said. Jim's story is ridiculous, but that almost makes me think that he must be innocent. Surely someone who had killed a woman could think up a better story, but then again, maybe that's exactly what he would like us to think. So this kind of weird double bluff, I mean, that's kind of weird. I don't know. Here's actually a pretty interesting post by Aliona Karp. 7 years ago now. The issue I have with a stranger abduction or a mountain lion is that it seems impossible if we accept Jim's story. Wouldn't he have noticed something from 25 to 30 feet away while looking away for literally only a minute? Not to mention heard something. Now, I'm wondering if Jim's story could be substantially true, but not the time and distance parts. One of them wandered off to answer nature's call, or walked a little bit ahead on the trail, or got into an argument and huffed off. If there had been an argument, would Jim offer up that information? Let's say he's completely innocent, but he knows it would make him look bad, so maybe he would change the story slightly since he knows he's innocent and he doesn't want to make himself look guilty. So he changed it slightly, but that slight change is what's causing this case to still be unsolved. Then Barbara disappears. Jim is embarrassed that they got parted on the trail, and as a man, he might think he should have been looking out for her. Maybe he doesn't realize at first how serious this whole thing is, and doesn't want himself to make himself look bad, so he takes refuge in every kid's favorite lie. It was only a minute. And then later, it's too late to tell the truth because that would seem way more suspicious. Other people are still kind of sticking to the mountain lion story, but you would think that there would be some kind of evidence, not to mention with the thermal drone flyovers. Even if the mountain lion killed her, did the mountain lion bury her or hide her in some way so she wouldn't come up on the thermal imaging scan? I don't know. Someone from the area said that they're local, but they never heard of this story, and they never even heard that there was a reward to identify the two men on the trail. And so they criticized that there was not enough publicity done in this case. User since deleted. I mean, this is curious, though. There are some really interesting comments by a person with the initials LP on this article about Bolick on newwest.net, and it's no longer available, but here's the copy-pasted comment. Hello, I just found this blog. Every couple of weeks, I still think about Barbara, and tonight I was thinking of her again, and my internet search took me here. I am so glad that there are others out there that have not forgotten her. A little background on me. I was the leader of the search and rescue team that went up the trail that first evening to look for Barb. I never in a million years doubted that we would find her that day. I interviewed Jim, and my first thought was that for someone to just disappear that fast, either he was not telling the whole truth, or she had gone over the edge of the cliffs, a several hundred-foot drop-off. So I called in the care fighter helicopter, and they searched the area below the cliffs that afternoon and evening as we searched the trail and mountain. I asked my supervisor to bring in the dogs right away, as I just felt something was not right. I can't go into full detail here with all that I went through for 5 months trying to find Barbara. I literally was on that mountain dozens of times on my own, with search and rescue, and with friends, as well as with a private investigator that was hired by Barbara's husband. Some very, very weird things transpired. I actually was asked to stop my relentless searching for her by the sheriff. I would not quit, as I had promised Barb's husband that first night I would find her. The sheriff fired me from search and rescue. I was one of their most trained and valuable members for 5 years and was nominated to become president of search and rescue. It angered him that I was putting more effort into the search for Barbara than his department was doing, and hence I was not following the chain of command. He asked me to stop looking, and I wouldn't. I couldn't. Maybe because as a middle-aged woman that hikes alone in the woods, I needed to know what happened. Anyhow, there's a lot I can't talk about that transpired, and even to this day, I flip-flop between thinking that Barbara left of her own choosing and that someone abducted or harmed her. I can tell you that I definitely do not believe that a wild animal got her. And yes, cadaver dogs were used extensively on several occasions. I wish you well, and I know that I too think of Barbara often, and I still keep my eyes and ears open for more clues. The same sheriff recently came under criticism for discrediting the usefulness of social media in more recent missing person searches in the area. So is this just a buffoon of a sheriff who's not complicit in any way? But that did make me think, is it possible those two men that were on the trail had some kind of connection to the sheriff? And that there was some kind of accident, possibly not intentional foul play, but some kind of an accident. They wanted it covered up. But or is he just a buffoon who doesn't believe in publicity, social media, and all of these things? And he also has an ego issue and does not want to be upstaged by search and rescue. Now, of course, we don't know the veracity of this post here. It may or may not be by the actual person who is the search and rescue leader. Another post here, there are known hermit mountain men that live in the wilderness in the Bitterroot Valley. I think this possibility should be explored more. A response, I agree, and I think this scenario is more likely than a mountain lion attack because there was no trace of her ever found on the mountain. But, so how experienced would these mountain men have to be to leave absolutely no trace? I mean, again, I don't know. I don't know how good these mountain men can be in leaving absolutely no trace. But if that's their full-time profession, living in the mountains as a hermit while leaving no trace, and they've been doing that for years and decades, perhaps they do have the skills required to leave no trace. I don't know. Someone more experienced in the wilderness can chime in here. Also, another thing I think about, like, there's a construction site nearby. Is it possible there's some kind of an accident and cover-up regarding the construction site? Maybe with or without ties to the sheriff? What kind of construction site was it? Was there cement being poured? I mean, is it possible for the thermal imaging not to pick up a body if there's some kind of construction equipment or cement involved? I mean, is it just another weird coincidence that there's a construction site nearby? Another commenter here stated that the construction crew saw the two young men with the dog and talked to them briefly. And then they left, and Jim didn't come for another 40 minutes to an hour afterwards to inquire. Another poster brought this up. I also find the story about the husband's cousin's hangover vaguely suspicious. Deliberately providing a plausible scenario about why Jim and Barbara should be hiking alone together, ? Something about it just pings my hink-o-meter. I mean, is it just too curious that there's no corroboration that she was on the trail that day? So that's definitely a bizarre one. Barbara Bolick, we really don't know what happened. Back to the Mysterious Universe article. Yet another creepy recent case happened in 2008. On the evening of May 14th, 2008, 19-year-old college student Brandon Swanson was on his way to visit his family in Marshall, Minnesota, when he lost control of his car and crashed into a ditch. Brandon was not injured, but without a ride, he decided to call his parents to have them come pick him up. He called them on his cell phone, tried to explain to them where he was, but they were not able to find him. His father then called Brandon's cell phone to ask for more details on where they could find him, and his son told him he was headed toward the town of Lind. As they talked, Brandon reportedly suddenly cursed, and then the line went dead. Subsequent efforts to call him back went unanswered, and the police were called in, who were able to locate the car but could not find any trace of Brandon or his phone. It remains a mystery as to where he went and why he abruptly swore when talking to his father on the phone before disappearing without a trace. And the Brandon Swanson case has been extensively requested on MINDSHOCK. I will be getting to that relatively soon, in the next month or so, hopefully. And I have started to do a deep dive into that case. There are some curiosities and anomalies and possibly smoking gun information that could lead to solving that case. It might not have been an interdimensional vortex, because normally in those situations you don't know what's coming, and you're not gonna... It seems more likely that there was some kind of encounter with an individual or vehicle. But again, I will leave that for another dedicated episode. On rare occasions, there has even been video evidence put forward purportedly showing people disappearing in the blink of an eye. One such piece of weird video footage uploaded to YouTube seems to show a man walking along a dark street in Jackson, Wyoming, which seems rather normal enough until he seems to steadily fade until all that remains are 2 white dots where his feet should be. These white spots continue right along until they are off camera. There's a good chance this is some sort of video glitch or even a hoax, but it is certainly a bizarre piece of footage. The video can be seen here, and then there is a link here. Man disappears into thin air while walking down a darkened street. And see, did they ever identify this individual? Because if they didn't, if they did and there's an actual missing persons report, like, we could really examine this further. But there doesn't seem to be. I mean, it's a creepy video. It looks like it just could be some kind of time-lapse. I mean, this easily could be some kind of time-lapse, not even necessarily glitch, but just a time-lapse ghosting, whatever they call it. This was uploaded May 7th, 2014. I mean, to me, there's really nothing here. So I'm not really going to go into that further. What are we to make of these cases of people just vanishing within seconds? There have been many theories seeking to explain this phenomenon, ranging from scientific to the decidedly fringe. Some of the more far-out theories have revolved around alien abduction, stumbling through spontaneous interdimensional portals, and also time slips. Those subscribing to the alien theory point out that few spontaneous vanishing people who have later been found often exhibit what are considered classic signs of alien abduction, such as disorientation, lost memories, and missing time. Author and researcher David Paulides has explained on this further, saying, quote, "In the vast majority of the cases that are chronicled, if people are found, they are located unconscious or semi-conscious, and many times in areas that were previously searched. In the vast majority of these incidents, the people are so young they cannot speak, or they have a disability that prohibits them from speaking, or they can't remember what happened. In the rare incidents where they do remember facts, they are baffling." And again, I go back to what I said at the opening. If these are some kind of interdimensional trickster entities, are they just screwing with human beings by putting them back in areas that were previously searched for maximum hilarity on their part? Is that what they find amusing? Others have proposed that there are certain areas in the world that just seem to suck people in and never let go. In his book, Missing 411, David Paulides investigates 411 cases of bizarre missing person reports with baffling clues. One of the theories he shares is that there seem to be around 30 geographical cluster points where most of these vanishings occurred, and that these disappearances often happened within moments and in areas full of witnesses. In many of the cases of people disappearing in these areas, baffling clues were left behind, such as clothes removed and neatly folded. And that's really creepy, too. I mean, I will get to that, but that is creepy. Are there truly places in the world that, for whatever reason we may never know, simply make people vanish? Of course, there is also the long list of reasons for why someone might choose to disappear, such as to escape problems, start fresh, or otherwise get away from their life. The problem is that in most of these cases, the individual was well adjusted and happy with their life. This same reason tends to discount ideas that they may have went off to commit suicide. Abduction by kidnappers is a possibility, but how could this be done so quickly, suddenly, and completely, often with other people around and with no evidence left behind? There is also the fact that in reports I've been listing here, the person had vanished within seconds or even faded away in full view of observers. This seems to be something weirder than people just running away from home or being abducted in the conventional sense. Perhaps the most likely answer for some of these cases, in particularly the older ones, is that they have been exaggerated over the years, are mixed with elements of fiction, or are even downright made up. This has already been shown to have been the case with several such cases of supposed spontaneous vanishings. Perhaps the most notable example would be the infamous mysterious disappearance of David Lang. For those who have never heard the tale, the story goes that on September 23, 1880, a farmer named David Lang was strolling across a field near Gallatin, Tennessee, where he suddenly just blinked out of existence as his wife, children, and 2 men passing nearby in a buggy all looked on in disbelief. When the whole area was checked, they could find no sign of where David had gone. Making things even weirder was a 15-foot diameter circle of yellowed dead grass, where David had disappeared, and faintly ghostly voices heard by his children 7 months later in the exact spot where he had vanished, which they claimed belonged to their father. Wow, that is really creepy, though. Made up or not, that is creepy. It all seems like such an amazing story, and for years it was treated as a genuine case of unexplained phenomena. But over time, it has become apparent that it probably never happened. Although the original mention of the story, the July 1953 issue of Fate magazine, as well as the 1958 book by Harold Wilkins called Strange Mysteries of Time and Space, both treat the account as an authentic account of high strangeness, it is most likely not true. Researchers who have investigated the case found that there is absolutely no record of a Lang family in Gallatin, Tennessee at that time, no news reports from the era mentioning the case, and no missing person reports filed at the time for a David Lang. It is now mostly thought that the story was a fiction created by the writer of the original Fate magazine article, Stuart Palmer, as a journalistic hoax, and who likely got the idea from a story called The Difficulty of Crossing a Field, which was written by a well-known but eccentric writer fascinated by the unknown named Ambrose Bierce, which we went over, who himself went missing. And so a long-beloved staple of many works on Fortean phenomena and an unexplained turned out to be almost certainly based on a fictional account. Although, just to counter that point, if the David Lang story is true and it was covered up, for whatever reason, if this was aliens with the crop circle possibility, was it covered up, people intimidated, erased from history? Maybe. Or did they want to protect, for whatever reason, the privacy of the individuals, and they changed the name of the family, possibly even the name of the town, and even the year, in which case they would have obviously not found it. It all depends on the intentions at the time, which we don't know. Again, the burden of proof is on positive claims, so I'm not saying it's true in any way. But if it is, perhaps those are the reasons why they intentionally wanted it not to be known. Maybe just leave some kind of clue. Now, I'm not saying that's more likely than it being completely fabricated just for whatever, for stories, because obviously there's a lot of hoaxes out there. But some other famous real accounts are also probably at least a little tainted by fiction. Another famous case, often listed as genuine in Fortean literature, is the story of Charles Ashmore. In this account, on a cold, snowy November night in 1878 in the town of Quincy, Illinois, a young man by the name of Charles Ashmore allegedly left his house to go get water from a nearby well. When he did not return to the house as expected, his father and sister became concerned that something might have happened to him out in the icy weather. Thinking that Charles might have tripped or even slipped and fell into the well, they went out to investigate. When they got inside, there was no sign of Charles anywhere, and he did not respond to having his name called out in the night. Bizarrely, the only clue left behind was his clear footprints in the snow, which abruptly stopped halfway to the well. That's really creepy as well. The surrounding snow was pristine and unmarked by any tracks or signs of a fall. It seemed as if Charles Ashmore had simply vanished into thin air halfway through his chore. This is interesting because it is strikingly similar to the tale of a young boy, variously called Oliver Larch, or Oliver Thomas, and which happens to be on a Christmas Eve, usually described as being in 1889. As with the Ashmore case, Oliver goes out to get water from a well during a Christmas party at his house. In the story, Oliver's family suddenly hears screams from outside the house and rush out to see a strange light in the air. They then notice that the boy's tracks stop in the snow halfway to the well, and his terrified voice can be heard shouting from the air, "Help, it's got me, it's got me." Wow, are these like invisible aliens or something? The reason why the two accounts are so similar is that the story of Oliver Larch is most likely based on the story of Charles Ashmore, which was also an account written by none other than Ambrose Bierce, who just so happened to have an obsession with missing persons cases and is also the source of the story which influenced the David Lang account. You know what's weird though? If Bierce was some kind of legitimate researcher, and he was basing these stories on accounts that he found, or maybe stories that were told to him that either were false, but he believed they were true, or possibly they were true in some form, and this was his take on them. In fact, the story of Charles Ashmore, titled Charles Ashmore's Trail, was published in the same short story collection as the story, which seems to have influenced the David Lang account, an 1893 book called Can Such Things Be? Although Bierce had a genuine interest in the paranormal and unexplained vanishings in particular, and also wrote many of his stories in a way that made them seem as if they were based on real events, they were probably totally fabricated or, at best, fact mixed with good amounts of fiction, as many of his stories were known to be. The reason his work was first treated as a credible source was probably due to the fact that he wrote in such a realistic, convincing way, claiming to have done interviews with families of the victims and other witnesses, and to have gone to these sites to investigate such disappearances. I mean, can that be verified or debunked that long ago? I mean, I don't know. It is hard with Bierce's work to tell where the line is between the real and the fantastical. This has caused many of his stories to be picked up as real disappearances that actually occurred, often changing slightly over the years and muddying the waters for those looking for the genuine article with real sources, blurring the line between what is reliable information and what is not. This sort of thing shows that a simple fiction or exaggeration can take on a life of its own and become treated as fact. Indeed, Bierce's work was often sourced in many other articles, journals, and books without anyone being none the wiser that it was all based on a source that was questionable at best and bogus at worst. The fact that so many books on the paranormal and unexplained have frequently mentioned these stories that are based on fictional accounts does not bode well for the other myriad of similar cases of people vanishing into thin air, and one wonders if a lot of these tales are simply colored with fiction or complete hogwash. With these strong indications of unexplained phenomena being treated as real based on fictional sources, it is hard with these bizarre accounts of spontaneous vanishings to separate what might have actually happened from what is pure fancy. At the very least, some of these cases must be taken with a grain of salt. So when dealing with these missing persons cases, what are we looking at? Aliens, interdimensional portals, time slips, strange zones that erase people from existence, simple crime or foul play. Are these people who just decided to make themselves disappear? Or is it all exaggeration and fiction? Perhaps in the end, the explanation for these strange cases involves a mixture of all of the above, and that they should not be clumped together, but rather be each treated almost like a separate phenomenon to be looked at on its own. It seems that each case must be looked at and analyzed separately on its own merits and evidence if we are to come to any understanding of what truly happened. Until we do, such stories are likely to continue to capture imagination with their simple and chilling premise, the idea that we can just suddenly disappear into thin air at a moment's notice to blink out of existence without warning and never be heard from again. And you know what? That actually brings me to my next point here. This is a theory that has not really been discussed, but there was a really, really creepy comment on, I don't know if it was Reddit or somewhere, maybe a YouTube comment. I don't know where it was discussed. But it said something like the universe. I mean, I guess to some extent, some could tie this into quantum theory where apparently the victims of serial killers, somehow there's some kind of subconscious thing going on where the universe somehow attracts certain victims to the serial killer, as if by some unseen forces or the subconscious thoughts of the potential victim, with or without their knowledge. But it was so creepy I couldn't shake it. Obviously, I'm not suggesting this is the case in all missing persons cases or even 90% of them, but one has to wonder in just a small tiny percentage of cases, how much did the subconscious thinking of the victims affect their encounter with a serial killer? Now, due to whatever influences, negative energies, whatever it maybe made the victim think that they were not valuable or worthy in any way, and somehow guided them into the clutches of a serial killer. Now, what made me think here, what if there is some kind of subconscious thing going on too, in a certain small percentage of cases of these spontaneous disappearances, where the thoughts manifest into the reality, where there's some kind of subconscious trauma and people literally will themselves into vanishing and just disappearing from this realm, possibly manifesting in another realm. But either way, if this is a case of thoughts creating reality, those who are unhappy with their life and literally wish to disappear into thin air, is it possible that they actually do so? Now again, we're not falling for any kind of false dichotomy logical fallacies. I'm not suggesting that this explains missing 411 in any way, but a small 0.001% of cases, is this the way to explain them? So there you have it, quite a few strange and bizarre disappearances in the missing 411 sphere. Obviously, plenty more to come. We'll be taking a look at even more baffling accounts, more modern accounts, 2000s and onward, Obviously, there's still quite a few in the 1900s we didn't go over, but we also need to go over some of these more modern accounts, more recent accounts where we have a lot of eyewitness testimony and just more recent information. So these cases, I don't want to say are easier to dissect necessarily, but there's more information available. Obviously, they are still bizarre and unexplained. Whether it's interdimensional Bigfoot, interdimensional trickster spirits, aliens, or the U.S. government itself running some kind of top secret operations. Now, the coincidence theorists would maintain that that's a complete impossibility, but again, just take a look at the MK Ultra documents released. I mean, they're pulling civilians off of streets and taking them to black sites and turning them into sleeper agents. Why wouldn't they have a project to do that in the vast wilderness, where it would be even easier to get away with than in metropolitan areas? Now, the other thing coincidence theorists and authority-worshipping cultists, too mentally weak to logically analyze these theories, to seriously consider them, if they were willing to admit what they did for MK Ultra, what are they not willing to admit? What remains classified or above top secret status? Many things to ponder regarding the many missing 411 cases. Hope you guys enjoyed another edition of the MindShock podcast. If you want to support the podcast, help us get more mind-shocking content out there, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications. Like and share, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic logical analysis, co-podcaster requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. You could also support the channel by becoming a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.